The damp night air of 1944 hangs heavy over the Auvergne forest, smelling of wet pine and cheap German tobacco. Nancy Wake stands in the shadows, her eyes scanning the tree line with lethal precision. Her breath is a controlled, shallow rhythm that barely disturbs the delicate lace of her collar. A few yards away, a Gestapo sentry stands guard, unaware of the predator watching him from the dark. In one swift motion, she strikes, her training taking over as she lunges from the pitch-black shadows. There is only the sickeningly soft thud of a body hitting the earth as the life leaves her enemy. Nancy stands still for a moment, listening to the frantic drumming of her own pulse in the sudden silence. She looks at her hands, the same hands that once typed society columns in Paris, now stained with the grim reality of a secret war. She turns away from the dim light, vanishing back into the forest like a ghost before the enemy can even react. The white mouse has just struck again, and the most expensive bounty in the history of the Third Reich is about to become their worst nightmare. In the early 30s, Paris was a fever dream of jazz, silk, and cigarette smoke, where Nancy reigned as the queen of the newsroom. She was an Australian runaway who traded Sydney's dust for the electric boulevards of France. Her days were a blur of clicking typewriters and cheap wine in Montmartre's basement clubs. She had a sharp, cynical mind that could cut through a politician's lie in seconds, always hunting for a story that actually mattered. By night, she moved through the city's exclusive bars with a sharp wit and a glass of champagne. But beneath her expensive silk dresses, she felt the fragility of this golden age, sensing an approaching, inevitable darkness. A cold, bitter wind began to blow from the east, carrying the stench of old hatreds across the Rhine. Headlines shifted from fashion to border skirmishes, and the carefree laughter of the Parisian streets turned into jagged fear. In 1933, she was sent to Vienna to interview a rising political star. She found that the city of grand opera had become a dark, suffocating stage for a violent performance that would soon consume the entire continent. She watched the swastika unfurled over ancient squares like a spreading stain. Thousands of polished jackboots hit the pavement in a terrifying rhythmic unison that sounded like the heartbeat of a monster waking up to kill. Vienna no longer smelled of coffee and pastry, it smelled of raw fear and wet asphalt. Nancy stood alone in a sea of brown shirts, realizing with cold clarity that her civilized world was about to be burned to the ground. She watched in visceral horror as Jewish men and women were forced to scrub the streets with toothbrushes while crowds cheered. Ordinary men had turned into monsters, and she felt a physical sickness radiating from her very soul. It wasn't just a headline for her newspaper anymore, it was a bleeding wound. Her faith in Europe was shattered, and the ink in her pen felt like heavy lead as she recorded evidence of a massive, unfolding crime. She saw an elderly man beaten until the cobblestones turned a slick, dark red. In that moment, the objective journalist in her died a violent death, and a silent, lethal warrior was born from the remains of her innocence. On the train back to Paris, her eyes were hard and cold as flint. She watched the landscape rush by in a gray blur, carrying a dark secret that the world refused to see. The war was already here. "I will do everything to stop this," she whispered to the empty, shadowed cabin. It was a vow made in blood, a promise to trade her silk dresses for the shadows of the woods in the cold weight of lead. Back in Paris, she met Henry Fiocca, a wealthy industrialist who fell for her fire. He never realized he was marrying a human hurricane that would eventually destroy his peace and pull him into the heart of the storm. She loved Henry with a desperate intensity, knowing their happiness was borrowed time. She knew her gold wedding ring would soon be traded for resistance bullets, stolen from the jaws of the monster she saw in Vienna. By the summer of 1940, the golden dream of Paris had been replaced by the gray, suffocating reality of the Nazi occupation. Nancy and Henri fled south to Marseille, a sun-drenched port city that was quickly becoming a desperate crossroads for spies, refugees, and the first whispers of resistance. Marseille was a city of heat and secrets, where the salt air was thick with paranoia in the shadows of the Vichy police. Nancy didn't just find a home there, she found a purpose, using her husband's wealth and her own social status as a perfect shield for her increasingly dangerous activities. She joined the O'Leary Line, a sophisticated escape network led by a charismatic doctor dedicated to smuggling downed Allied pilots and escaped prisoners of war across the treacherous Pyrenees Mountains into neutral Spain. Her role was simple yet lethal. She was a courier and a guide, a woman who looked like a socialite but moved with the cold precision of a predator. She became a master of disguises, changing her identity as easily as her lipstick, always staying one step ahead of the Gestapo. The Germans knew there was a woman at the heart of the network, a ghost who moved through their checkpoints with a smile and a wink. They called her defiance Maus, the White Mouse, because every time they thought they had her cornered, she simply vanished into thin air. Nancy was fearless, often drinking in the same bars as German officers to gather intelligence, her laughter masking a mind that was constantly calculating routes, safe houses, and the lives of the men she was sworn to protect. She personally escorted hundreds of men through the narrow, winding alleys of Marseille and onto the steep, rocky paths that led to freedom. Every trip was a gamble with death, where a single mistake or a traitor's word could end in a firing squad or a one-way trip to a concentration camp. But the pressure was mounting, and the Gestapo, led by the brutal Klaus Barbie, was tightening the noose around Marseille. They began to arrest her colleagues, and the rewards for the capture of the White Mouse reached millions of francs, turning every stranger into a potential threat. Her house was under constant surveillance, and the once loving home she shared with Henri became a fortress of secrets and unspoken fears. Henri knew the risks, yet he supported her completely, providing the funds and the cover that kept the network alive during its darkest hours. In late 1942, the network was betrayed from within, and the Gestapo finally moved to strike at the heart of the O'Leary Line. Nancy was forced to make a heartbreaking choice: stay and face certain execution, or flee and leave behind the man she loved to face the consequences. Henri insisted she go, promising they would reunite when the storm had passed, his eyes filled with a tragic certainty that neither of them wanted to acknowledge. He gave her his blessing and a final desperate embrace, standing as a shield while his wife vanished into the night. Nancy's escape from Marseille was a harrowing journey through a country crawling with enemies, where every shadow held a rifle and every checkpoint was a trap. She was no longer a journalist or a socialite. She was the most wanted woman in France, a ghost running for her life. She crossed the Pyrenees on foot, enduring freezing winds and treacherous terrain, her mind haunted by the image of Henri standing in the doorway. She made it to Spain and then to London, but the woman who arrived there was forged in steel and fueled by a singular, burning desire for revenge. In London, she was recruited by the Special Operations Executive, the SOE, to be trained as a professional saboteur and spy. She learned to kill with her bare hands, to jump from planes, and to lead an army, preparing for the day she would return to France to finish what she started. In April 1944, Nancy stepped into the void over the Auvergne. She didn't feel like a hero, just the sudden jerk of the risers and the biting cold air. Instead of a grand return, it was a mess. She crashed through the canopy of a pine tree and ended up dangling 10 feet above the ground, tangled in parachute silk. When the partisans emerged from the darkness, their leader, Henri Tardivat, smirked. Looking at the woman hanging helplessly from the branches, he gallantly remarked that he wished to see such beautiful fruit on every tree in France. Nancy, scratched by needles and fuming at her own powerlessness, looked at him as if he were a dead man. She didn't play along with the pleasantries. All she needed was to feel the ground beneath her feet. Looking down at him, she hissed,
"Tar to that! Don't give me that rubbish! Just get me down and let's start killing Nazis!"
The time for poetry was over. The time for war had begun. The landing was just the beginning. In the camp, 7,000 men awaited. Men who lived by the laws of the forest and weren't used to taking orders from a woman in a skirt. Nancy knew that if she showed any weakness now, her authority would crumble to dust. She didn't lead from comfort. She slept on the same damp earth and ate the same horse meat as her fighters. One day, she held a weapon inspection. Passing by one of the commanders, she noticed a tiny speck of rust on his rifle. Nancy didn't just give him a warning, she snatched the weapon from his hands and tore into him so fiercely that the entire forest went silent. She roared in his face.
"If you can't take care of the piece of steel that saves your skin, the Germans will do it for you. Your laziness is a bullet in the back of your comrades."
From that day on, no one called her a gift from London. For them, she had become a commander whose rage was more terrifying than the Gestapo. The real war for Nancy began at night within the narrow corridors of the Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon. She led the breach team herself. The air was thick with the smell of old stone and imminent death. At one point, as they moved through the absolute darkness, a German sentry stepped out from around a corner. There was no time to shoot. A single sound would have turned the building into a death trap for her men. Nancy did exactly what she had been taught in the training camps of London. With one swift, calculated move, she delivered a lethal open-hand strike directly to the man's throat. He didn't have time to scream. He only let out a hollow, gargling sound before collapsing onto the stone floor. Nancy didn't freeze for a second. She simply stepped over the body, her mind already occupied by the timer on the explosives. Later, when asked about pity, she would only shrug. To me, he wasn't a man in that moment. He was an obstacle. If I had hesitated, my boys would have remained within those walls forever. In June 1944, everything nearly went up in flames. The Germans raided the partisan radio hub, leaving Nancy with no way to contact London. It was a total disaster. Without those codes, they couldn't request weapons, ammo, or even food. The nearest working radio was in Châteauroux, hundreds of kilometers away. So Nancy simply took an old bicycle. She had to ride 500 kilometers through mountain passes and SS patrols. She pedaled for 72 hours with almost no rest at all. By the end of the second day, reality began to blur. Her legs turned into lead pillars, and every single breath burned her lungs. At one checkpoint, a German officer stopped her. Nancy, staggering from exhaustion, found the strength to smile and flirtatiously lie about visiting a cousin. He let her through. When she finally returned and delivered the codes, she simply collapsed. Later, she would say,
"At that moment, I hated that bicycle more than I hated Hitler. But if I hadn't made it, my men would have starved to death long before any German bullets could reach them."
Nancy Wake was born on August 30th, 1912. She was never meant for a quiet life, and she proved it every single day until her very last breath. When the smoke finally cleared over liberated France, the world learned the name of the woman the Gestapo feared most. She emerged from the shadows as the most decorated servicewoman of the Allied forces, holding the highest honors from 3 different countries. Nancy lived a long, defiant life, passing away on August 7th, 2011, at the age of 98. She proved that one person's will can be stronger than an entire war machine. According to her final wish, her ashes were scattered over the Auvergne Mountains. the same rugged peaks where she once jumped into the void and rode through hell on a bicycle. Nancy once said,
I don't see why we women should just sit at home and take it. I hate wars and violence, but if they come, I don't see why we shouldn't be there. The white mouse didn't just escape the trap, she tore it apart.
The story of Nancy Wake is a powerful reminder of what one person can achieve in the name of freedom. If stories like hers inspire you as much as they inspire us, please consider subscribing to the channel. We continue to bring you stories of people whose will proved to be stronger than history itself. Thank you for watching and for keeping these memories alive.